Hello, and welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration public meeting for the draft air tour management plan for Canyonlands National Park. I'm Michelle Carter, an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'll be your moderator this evening. I'd like to start off by defining a couple of acronyms that you'll hear us use throughout the meeting. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as FAA, and the Air Tour Management Plans as ATMPs. We'll define the remaining acronyms as we go along. Next slide, please. We're holding this virtual public meeting to review the draft ATMP for Canyonlands and to seek public feedback on the draft. This meeting is being held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, also known as NAPATMA, and its implementing regulations. You'll hear more about NAPATMA and the draft ATMP shortly, along with information on how you can submit questions and official comments. But before we dive into the presentations, I'd like to take a minute to introduce our presenters and provide a little bit more information about the meeting logistics and how you can participate. Next slide. Joining us this evening as presenters are Eric Elmore, Senior Policy Advisor with the Office of Environment and Energy of FAA. From the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, we have Vicki Ward, Overflights Program Manager. And from Canyonlands National Park, we have the Park Superintendent, Patty Trapp, the Park Ecologist, Matt Van Scoik, and the Park Planner, Amy Tindick. Eric and Vicki are going to provide a brief overview of NAPATMA and the purpose of today's meeting. And then we'll hear from the park staff who will share information from the park's perspective and to discuss park specific resources in the context of the draft ATMP. Next slide, please. Throughout the meeting, we invite you to submit your questions and we'll address them after the presentations as part of the Q&A session. Questions submitted through today's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they continue drafting the ATMP, but they won't actually be considered formal comments. Next slide. All official comments must be submitted through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment site, or PEPC as we call it, or sent to the mailing addresses that are listed on the park's PEPC site. Only comments received through one of these two avenues will become part of the official record, and these comments must be submitted on or before October 3rd of this year. The agencies are not accepting official comment via email, but we'll share a little bit more information about this later in the presentation. Next slide, please. This meeting is being live streamed across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're watching on one of these platforms, you can submit your questions using the link to the Google form that FAA is going to post in the chat area of whatever platform you're using. When the time comes, we'll read your question aloud and our presenters will respond. And the team's going to do our best to get to all of the questions, but in the event that we don't get to your question, we'll provide contact information at the end where you can go for post-meeting follow-up. And if you want to grab a pen and paper to have it handy for the end of the meeting, it'd be good to do so. Our meeting is going to be 90 minutes long, and we plan to adjourn at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. If we get through all of the questions early, we'll keep the meeting active until 6, just in case additional questions come in. And please note, this meeting is also being recorded. We appreciate you joining us this evening to learn more about Canyonlands draft ATMP. We're now going to play a short video overview before I turn it over to Eric and Vicki to provide additional details about NAPATMA and why we're here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as Air Tour Management Plans, and today we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft Air Tour Management Plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everybody. My name is Eric Elmore, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Environment and Energy with the Federal Aviation Administration. Today, I'd like to provide you with an overview of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, NEPATMA, and my colleague Vicki Ward will provide you an overview of air tour management plans. Next slide, please. So NEPATMA requires the FAA, in cooperation with the National Park Service, to develop an air tour management plan for parks and tribal lands where air tour operators have applied to conduct commercial air tours. The act applies to commercial air tours that operate within a half mile of a park, over tribal lands within or abutting a park, and in the airspace that is from ground level to 5,000 feet above ground level, or as we refer to it as AGL. Next slide, please. So NEPATMA does not apply to general aviation, commercial airline, or military flights. It strictly applies to commercial air tour operations. And I'll also add that it does not apply to unmanned aircraft. So it's strictly commercial air tours. NEPATMA does not apply to Alaska parks, Grand Canyon National Park, or Rocky Mountain National Park. In 2012, NEPATMA was amended, and it states that parks that have 50 or fewer reported flights per year are exempt from developing an air tour management plan, unless this exemption is withdrawn by the National Park Service. In addition, if abutting tribal lands are or may be overflown, the tribes must be invited as cooperating agencies under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. Next slide. So NEPATMA applies to commercial air tour operators, and in 2000, operators had to apply to FAA for operating authority in order to continue. So operations were going on at the time, air tour operations were going on at the time NEPATMA was enacted in 2000. And through that act, FAA had to issue what is known as interim operating authority that basically put a number, a cap number on the operations that could be conducted. It did not provide for any limitations or routes or anything. It was just strictly a cap. And so there are basically two categories of air tour operators. There are those that are existing commercial air tour operators, and those would be the ones that have IOA in general. And then there is also what is called new entrant commercial air tour operators. So that there could be a new entrant that wants to operate. They would have to apply for authority. They would be considered a new entrant. Next slide. I'll hand it over to Vicki. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I'm Vicki Ward. I'm with the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division in the National Park Service, and I'll continue the overview of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. We are here to go over the draft air tour management plan tonight, and the objective for that is from the PATMA, and that objective is to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts, if any, resulting from commercial air tour operations upon natural and cultural resources, visitor experiences, and tribal lands. Next slide. An air tour management plan has some certain contents that are also provided for by the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. And an air tour management plan may prohibit commercial air tour operations in whole or in part. So air tour operations could be banned from the entire park, or could be allowed over part of the park. An air tour management plan may establish conditions for the conduct of the air tour operations. So that would include routes, altitudes, time of day restrictions, restrictions for particular events, such as a ceremony or other event that they would like to have aircraft free or noise from air tours free, and the maximum number of flights, and that could be on a daily or a yearly or a seasonal basis. The air tour management plan applies only to commercial air tour operations within a half-mile outside the boundary of a national park or below 5,000 feet above ground level, and it must include incentives for the adoption of quiet aircraft technology. Those are models of aircraft, either helicopters or fixed wing aircraft, that are quieter than the standard models. An air tour management plan must also provide for the allocation of opportunities to conduct air tours when ATMP limits the number of operations. And then air tour management plan also documents the needs and justifies the need for the measures taken to establish the routes or the altitudes or the time of day restrictions, the things that are listed above. And those things need to be justified in the air tour management plan and also in the record of decision. Next slide. So this is a map of the United States for folks who might be calling in and can't see the screen. This shows the locations of the 24 parks that FAA and NPS are currently working on. We are working on these concurrently, and the air tour plans for the parks are spread across the US, mostly in the Western US, but we have a couple parks in the Eastern US, Everglades in Florida, Statue of Liberty and Governor's Island in New York, and then heading west, we have 2 parks in South Dakota, and then a cluster of parks in southern Utah. Canyonlands is one of those, which we're meeting about tonight. And then also the San Francisco Bay Area parks, Olympic and Mount Rainier in Washington, and then 2 parks in Hawaii. Next slide. So in developing an air tour management plan, the agencies, and this is required by the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, those are published in the Federal Register, the notice that those are available. We hold at least 1 public meeting to get input from the public into the draft air tour management plan. The air tour management plan process also will comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and other legal requirements such as the National Historic Preservation Act and the Endangered Species Act. And then where applicable, we invite tribes to participate as cooperating agencies for NEPA compliance in cases where tribal lands are or may be overflown by air tours. And then, as we've mentioned earlier, the purpose of today's meeting is to review the components of the draft air tour management plan for Canyonlands National Park. Thank you for joining us for this meeting today, and I will turn it back over to Michelle, and Superintendent Trapp.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric and Vicki, for that. Like Vicki said, now we'll hear from Park Superintendent Patty Trapp, then Matt and Amy for more perspective from the park.
Thank you for the introduction, Michelle. And as Michelle said, my name is Patty Trapp, and as the Superintendent of Canyonlands National Park, I welcome and thank all of you for participating in today's meeting. I will begin by gratefully acknowledging our 26 traditionally associated tribes as the first protectors of Canyonlands. An important part of this planning process is our consultation and inclusion of American Indian tribes who have deep cultural connections with Canyonlands. We recognize that it is on their ancestral homelands we gather, and we thank them for their continued stewardship. Congress established Canyonlands National Park in 1964 to preserve striking geologic landscapes and associated ecosystems in an area encompassing the confluence of the Green and Colorado rivers, possessing superlative scenic, scientific, and cultural features for the inspiration, benefit, and use of the public. The sacred archaeological sites and diverse recreational opportunities found in its 4 districts are unparalleled. And today, over 700,000 visitors visit Canyonlands each year, where they enjoy river running, driving, hiking, camping, backpacking, immersing themselves in the immense darkness of our night skies, or spending time exploring quiet vistas. Each of these experiences is worth protecting, and the goal of this draft air term management plan was created to do just that, preserve these opportunities. The draft plan balances preservation with access and recognizes that the airspace above the park should be managed with our unique resources in mind. More information on how to provide comments will be provided during the meeting. And after today's presentation, I encourage you to visit the park's planning website to submit your thoughts. And we look forward to hearing and learning from you. The experiences, scenery, and resources protected at Canyonlands are unrivaled. And that's what we are looking to you, our community, our stakeholders, and visitors, to provide comments on the park's draft air tour management plan. We value your input and we want to hear from you. Now I will turn the presentation over to Matthew Van Scoyoc, the park's ecologist and research coordinator.
Thank you, Patty, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Van Scoyoc, an ecologist for Canyonlands National Park. As Patty mentioned, this draft ATMP is intended to help us preserve and protect the resources in the park. As such, I'll be giving an overview of the spectacular cultural and natural resources found in the park. Canyonlands preserves over 337 acres of canyons, mesas, buttes, towers, fins, and natural stone arches on the Colorado Plateau in southeast Utah. The confluence of the Green and Colorado rivers lies at the heart of the park, dividing it into 4 distinct districts: the Island in the Sky to the north, the Maze to the west, the Needles to the south, and the River District dissecting the landscape. The park preserves a rich landscape of high desert on the Colorado Plateau and includes notable scientific interests, notable features of scientific interest, including Island in the Sky's upheaval dome, a labyrinth of canyons in the Maze, the Grabens of the Needles, and Cataract Canyon on the Colorado River. These distinct landscapes formed over hundreds of millions of years through multiple geologic processes, including sedimentation, erosion, salt dissolution, and tectonics. Approximately 85% of the land area within the park is recommended wilderness, which we manage as designated wilderness under the 2006 NPS management policies. Areas of the Canyonlands backcountry are minimally impacted by humans, and the natural sounds of the desert are predominant, providing opportunities for quiet and solitude. Next slide, please. Here you can see a map of the park to orient you. Canyonlands is highlighted in the black boundary line, and Glen Canyon National Recreation Area abuts the park to the west. The green squares indicate the location of the visitor centers for Island in the Sky, the Maze at Hands Flat, and the Needles. You can see there are 5 landing strips adjacent to the park. 2 are along the eastern boundary near the potash mines and at the Needles outpost, and there are 3 to the west. The Canyonlands Draft Air Tour Management Plan applies to all commercial air tours that fly anywhere within 1/2 mile of the boundary of the park, as represented by the gray line. Next slide, please. Cultural resources in the park span at least 10,000 years of human activity and occupation. The park protects many archaeological sites, including masonry and earthen structures, lithic scatters, pictographs and petroglyphs, and other traces of the indigenous people who lived here. Salt Creek and Horseshoe Canyon archaeological districts contain significant world-class archaeological sites, including the Great Gallery, an archetype of Barrier Canyon-style rock writing. Many Native American tribes are associated with the landscape, including Paiute, Ute, Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, and many other Pueblos. Historic era resources include those left by explorers, miners, and ranchers, including 1 historic district and 1 cultural landscape registered on the National Register of Historic Places. The Island in the Sky Mesa Top towers above the surrounding landscape, where you can trace the paths of the Green and Colorado rivers as they wind their way through the complex terrain below. The La Salle, Abajo, and Henry Mountains on the horizon. Soils on the mesa support grasslands and pinyon juniper woodlands, where resident birds like pinyon jays and migrating birds such as black-throated sparrows nest and rear their young. Sheer cliffs of Wingate sandstone separate the mesa top from the surrounding landscape. Peregrine falcons and red-tailed hawks occupy and defend territories along these cliffs and towers. Below the mesa, the black brush shrublands, grasslands, and bedrock outcrops of the White Rim are home to the rugged desert bighorn sheep. In the maze, you will find a labyrinth of canyons cut into this Cedar Mesa sandstone. The canyon bottoms provide habitat for mule deer, and you might find the tracks of coyotes, bobcats, or a mountain lion in the sand as you make your way to the harvest scene. The diverse communities of Salt Creek and the Needles District hold dense thickets of willow bordered by pinyon pine and Utah juniper, with pockets of grasslands in the corners of the canyons. Keen observers can find signs of elk or black bear, and you might hear the distant call of a Mexican spotted owl in the middle of the night. The lush riparian communities along the Green and Colorado rivers support willow, cottonwood, and hackberry, prime habitat for the federally listed Southwest willow flycatcher and the Western yellow-billed cuckoo. Next slide, please. 8 commercial air tour operators hold interim operating authority, which we will refer to as IOA, to conduct a combined total of 665 commercial air tours over Canyonlands each year. What this means is that operators were granted the authority by the FAA to fly commercial air tours over the park. 4 of those operators have not reported flying commercial air tours over Canyonlands since reporting began in 2013. 4 commercial air tour operators, Red Tail Aviation, Southwest Safaris, Grand Canyon Airlines, and American Aviation, currently conduct commercial air tours over the park. Based on the 3-year average of reporting data from 2017 to 2019, these 4 operators fly a total of 367 commercial air tours each year. Red Tail Aviation conducts an average of 357 commercial air tours. Southwest Safaris conducts an average of 7 commercial air tours. Grand Canyon Airlines conducts an average of 2 commercial air tours. And American Aviation conducts an average of 1 commercial air tour over the park each year. Under existing conditions, the annual number of commercial air tours over Canyonlands National Park is limited by the IOA. There are no restrictions on route, time of day, or the altitude to protect park resources or visitor experience. Additionally, there are no procedures in place to allow the park to establish no-fly periods for things like special events or park management projects. And lastly, there are currently no training or education requirements for the commercial air tours operators flying over the park. The provisions and conditions in the proposed ATMP address these issues in a manner designed to protect park resources and visitor experience from the impacts of commercial air tours and support NPS management objectives for Canyonlands. I will now hand it over to Amy Tendick.
Thank you, Matt. My name is Amy Tendick, and I am the Environmental Protection Specialist and Planner at Canyonlands National Park. And I'm going to discuss the details of the draft Air Tour Management Plan, which will be referred to as the ATMP. Under the ATMP, 367 annual commercial air tours are authorized. Prior to the development of a draft ATMP, 665 air tours were authorized under interim operating authority. This air tour management plan reduces the number of air tours authorized per year. Within the park and a half-mile buffer around the park boundary, air tours will fly no lower than 2,900 feet above ground level under the draft plan. Up until this draft plan, there were no restrictions on altitude. Only fixed-wing aircraft are currently conducting air tours over the park, and the draft ATMP states that any new or replacement aircraft must not exceed the noise level produced by the current aircraft in operation. Air tours may operate 2 hours after sunrise until 2 hours before sunset. Air tours may operate any day of the year, except the NPS can establish temporary no-fly periods that apply to air tours for special events or planned park management activities. Absent exigent circumstances or emergency operations, the NPS will provide a minimum of 15 days written notice to operators for any restrictions that temporarily restrict certain areas or certain times of day, or 60 days written notice to operators for any full day restrictions in advance of the no-fly period. Events may include tribal ceremonies or other important events in the park. Operators are required to submit semi-annual reports to the FAA and the NPS regarding the number of commercial air tours they have conducted over the park. When made available by park staff, operators or pilots may take at least one training course per year conducted by NPS staff. At the request of either of the agencies, the park staff, the local FAA Flight Standards District Office, and the operator may meet once per year to discuss the draft ATMP and any amendments or other changes to it. Next slide, please. All 4 operators currently have a total of 14 routes they typically fly, and all of them fly with fixed-wing aircraft over Canyonlands National Park. When looking at this map, and specifically at the legend, the first 2 routes shown are American Aviation's. Under this draft ATMP, they can fly 1 commercial air tour per year and can choose any of the 3 routes. The next 5 routes on the legend are flown by Southwest Safaris, and under this draft ATMP, they can fly 7 commercial air tours each year, and they can choose to fly any of these 5 routes. The next 3 routes after Southwest Safaris are flown by Redtail Aviation, and they may choose to fly any of their 3 routes on no more than 357 commercial air tours per year. The final 3 routes on the legend belong to Grand Canyon Airlines, and they are able to choose which of those routes to use on their commercial air tours per year. The proposed commercial air tours authorized under this draft ATMP would be conducted on the routes shown on this slide. These are the current routes already flown over the park. Under the draft ATMP, these routes will be flown at 2,900 feet above ground level. Next slide, please. The provisions and conditions of this ATMP are designed to protect park resources and the visitor experience from the effects of commercial air tours and to support NPS management objectives for the park. Under the Act, the FAA granted interim operating authority for air tours over the park. Referred to as IOA, this interim authority does not provide any operating conditions like routes, altitudes, or time of day for air tours. IOA only caps the number of air tours that can occur in a park annually. The total number of air tours authorized under this ATMP is consistent with the existing air tours reported over the park. The annual flight limits in this ATMP are intended to protect visitor experience, wildlife and cultural resources, and related cultural landscapes and ethnographic resources throughout the park by limiting the number of potential disturbances caused by commercial air tours. The condition that commercial air tours will fly no lower than 2,900 feet above ground level, referencing the topographic high point within a half-mile of the flight path, complies with guidance for raptor protection, including threatened and endangered and migratory birds. Because raptor habitat exists throughout the park and nest locations may change over time, the minimum altitude restriction extends uniformly to all routes over the park. It will further avoid or minimize potential effects on other avian species and wildlife by reducing the noise intensity of air tour events in the areas nearest the routes. Additionally, this provision improves visitor experiences on the ground, including opportunities for solitude and remoteness from sights and sounds in recommended wilderness areas, as well as conditions at cultural properties and landscapes, by reducing the intensity of air tour noise at ground level. In other words, the elevation of 2,900 feet above ground level is protective of raptors, but also of many other resources and visitor experiences in the park. Sunrise and sunset are important times of day for wildlife and visitors alike. Biologically important behaviors for many species occur during this time, such as the dawn chorus for songbirds. Wildlife viewing is often conducted during this time of day as well. Time restrictions have been included in this ATMP to protect these park resources. Designated hours of operation provide quiet periods of the day during which visitors can enjoy natural sounds, and these designated hours also preserve opportunities for solitude in backcountry areas. Operator training and education facilitates effective implementation of the ATMP by making sure operators remain informed regarding the requirements of this draft ATMP, including any adaptive management measures or amendments. It advances operator understanding of park management objectives and priorities, including noise-sensitive areas, and it provides opportunities to enhance the interpretive narrative for air tour clients. The annual meeting will be used to review and discuss implementation of the ATMP between park staff, local FAA Flight Standards District Office staff, and all operators, and will serve to ensure that air tour operators are aware of the terms and conditions of this ATMP and are made aware of new or recurring concerns regarding park resources. I will now turn it over to Eric from the FAA.
Thank you, Superintendent Trapp, and thank you to Matt and Amy as well for that presentation on the resources in Canyonlands, as well as a description of what's in this air tour management plan, this draft or air tour management plan. I'm going to provide now a description of the National Environmental Policy Act. Because this draft air tour management plan is a federal action, the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, were triggered, and FAA and Park Service must comply. So NEPA requires a few things. First, it requires the agencies to consider the human and natural environment that could be affected by this air tour management plan. We're required to determine the appropriate level of environmental review. And we're also required to prepare the associated environmental review documents. So at this time, the agencies have conducted an initial impact analysis and currently are considering developing this air tour management plan under a categorical exclusion. Now, a categorical exclusion does not mean that this is excluded from compliance with NEPA. Categorical exclusion is a form of complying with NEPA. During our categorical exclusion process, the agencies were also considering public comments on this ATMP, as well as getting information during the consultation processes that are involved with endangered species and historic preservation. And then we will fully assess all of the environmental impacts and information that we have before making a final decision on the appropriate level of environmental review. Next slide, please. So one of the other ongoing processes that the agencies are involved in is under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Now, under this statute, the FAA and the Park Service, we're currently working to complete the consultation process. And in general, it's a 4-step process that the agencies have to undergo. And first of all, we have to define the undertaking. So similar to NEPA, this development of an air tour management plan is an undertaking. So we've defined the undertaking and we have, I believe, already identified consulting parties. The second step is to determine the area of potential effect, or the APE, as well as to identify any historic properties. After that, we have to assess the effects to the historic properties. And then finally, we have to resolve adverse effects, if any are found, to these historic properties. At this time, the FAA and NPS have initiated consultation with the State Historic Preservation Officer, or the SHPO, tribes, and other consulting parties. So at this time, I would like to hand it over to Michelle to discuss the endangered species consultation process.
Thanks, Eric. So we touched on it a little bit earlier, but the FAA and NPS are complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act as they develop this ATMP. And you'll also hear us refer to the Endangered Species Act as ESA. This ensures that the proposed action does not jeopardize the existence of any listed species under ESA or result in destruction or adverse modification of any designated critical habitat. Agencies have begun informal consultation conversations with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the preliminary assessment by the agencies is not anticipating these types of effects. Next slide. So as noted earlier, we are currently inviting comment from the public, tribes, other agencies, and all interested parties on the draft ATMP. And comments must be received by October 3rd. I mentioned earlier that comments can be submitted one of two ways, either online through the National Park Service public comment website, and you'll see the link to that on the screen here, or if you want to submit it by mail, you can submit it using the mailing address also on the slide. And a reminder that the agencies are not accepting public comment through email. I also wanted to mention that there's a FAQ document that's posted on the park's Pepsi site alongside the draft ATMP. There's a lot of really good information in there. And so if somebody from FAA could drop the link to the Pepsi page into the social media platforms, it'd be appreciated. Next slide, please. So next steps, following the end of this public comment period, FAA and the NPS will review all the comments and will use them to inform the final ATMP. We'll continue to coordinate and complete tribal Section 106 and the Section 7 consultations, and we'll conclude the NEPA process by signing a decision document. Once all of this is wrapped up, the ATMP will be considered complete, and it will be posted on both the FAA and the National Park Service websites. FAA will then update the operation specifications for each air tour operator. Next slide, please. All right, and so with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of our presenters, and we can now turn to the Q&A portion of the meeting. If anybody may have joined during the presentations, my name is Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm serving as the moderator this evening. So if you have a question you want to submit, you can do so by posting it into the Google form using a link that FAA has shared in like the little chat area of whatever social media platform you're using. And just a reminder that the questions submitted through today's meeting will be considered by agencies as they continue drafting the ATMP, but they're not considered formal comments. Formal comments, as I mentioned a bit ago, must be submitted through the Pepsi site or sent to the parks via email, and again, by October 3rd. So at the beginning of the meeting, I mentioned that the whole meeting will be 90 minutes long. And so as long as we still have questions that are coming in, we'll keep it until 6 p.m. Mountain Time. In the event that questions do get addressed early, we'll stay on the line for a little bit, just allowing folks to maybe think through what you've heard on the presentations today, or maybe think through some of the responses you've heard to other questions. And if you have something else you'd like to submit in response to that, we'll stay on the line for a bit to hold on for that. Okay. And that being said, we'll go ahead and move over to the Q&A session. We have a couple that have come in here. So this first one will go over to Eric. And the question is asking what flights are included and does it apply to regular commercial flights?
Thank you, Michelle. So the question, what flights are included and does it apply to regular commercial flights? So again, the ATMP, the Air Tour Management Plan, NAPATMA, only applies to commercial air tours. So again, it does not apply to general aviation, military, UAS. There is a specific citation I can provide. So in implementing NAPATMA, the agency promulgated regulations, and the official definition, if you want, is found at 14 CFR, section 136.33. And a commercial air tour is defined as any flight conducted for compensation or hire in a powered aircraft for sightseeing over a national park unit within 1/2 mile outside the boundary of a unit of the national park system, or over tribal lands during which the aircraft flies at or below a minimum altitude of 5,000 feet above ground level, except for takeoff or landing, or as necessary for safe operation of the aircraft. Or if they're less than 1 mile laterally from any geographic feature within the park. So you can see kind of the constraints of the act, that it applies to only commercial air tours and not any other type of air operations. So thank you for the question.
Thank you for that response, Eric. Okay, next question here. We'll turn it over to Vicki, and the question is asking, I think, like, if this is a new program, and why do you want to bring air tours to the park?
Okay, thanks for the question. As we went over earlier, commercial air tours are already occurring over Canyonlands National Park, so this isn't a new program as far as air tours happening. 8 operators were authorized to fly a total of 665 commercial air tours per year. That was issued using the interim operating authority back from 2003. And also, as we mentioned, that interim operating authority it's only a number. It didn't set routes or operating conditions except that limit on the number. And then, so on the average of the 2017 through 2019, 367 commercial tours occurred over the park. And this is the annual number of air tours that's being proposed in the draft air tour management plan, which is a reduction on the current maximum allowed. The draft air tour management plan also includes conditions that are designed to protect natural and cultural resources and visitor experience by specifying the routes, altitude, aircraft type, daytime restrictions and restrictions for particular events. Without an air tour management plan, none of these conditions exist and the IOA stays in place. Thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Vicki. Okay, the next question's for Eric. They're asking, why are 13 different tour routes needed?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for that question. So the routes basically came from information that was provided by the operators. And so we took that information and we did an analysis of these routes, including endangered species and others. And based on that analysis, we didn't see a need to change the routes. However, we did increase the altitudes of these routes in response to consultation involving endangered species. And so that in combination with the other things in the air tour management plan in regards to the number of operations also kind of being limited, time of day and other factors, we feel that it's, well, that's how we came up with the routes, and hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thanks, Eric. All right, let's go back over to Vicki for the next question. Why do you provide ATMP tours to providers that may fly as little as one tour?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. The allocation of air tours is based on the number of flights that were currently being flown by the operators and which they reported. And as we noted, is a reduction from the interim operating authority. So if an operator only flies one tour per year, it's possibly in combination with other parks, then the operator has retained that allocation in the draft air tour management plan. And so as you noted with some of the routes, some of those routes may only be used a couple times a year based on the air tour operator's allocation. If you would like to see changes made to the draft air tour management plan or have comments, please submit your comments through Pepsi. Okay, thanks, Michelle.
Great. Okay. So we have a question here about drone usage in the park. And I think that Eric that mentioned this earlier, but ATMP does not actually cover drones. And it is important to note that launching, landing, or operating unmanned aircraft, which are drones, from national parks is prohibited. But thanks for the question. And moving on down here, we now have a question for Eric. Asking, what type of air tour monitoring equipment is the park staff currently using? And if they are, is it adequate? They're also asking, who's responsible for issuing citations to aviators who violate the ATMP and what the penalties for those violations would be?
I think I got all of that question, Michelle. So I think the first part was in regards to monitoring equipment, and currently the park does not have any air tour monitoring equipment. However, one of the provisions in this air tour management plan requires operators to equip their aircraft with flight monitoring technology and to report flight monitoring data as part of the semi-annual reports. The required data will include latitude, longitude, a number of other things, tail numbers, etc., that would be provided to the agency in a new format, I think digitally, hopefully. Operators there are required to use the flight monitoring technology during all air tours under the air tour management plan. So I think the air tour management plan does improve the situation in regards to monitoring of air tours. I can't remember. I think the second half was in regards to enforcement, I think. And so under the air tour management plan, so obviously this reporting equipment will help us in determining compliance, and any allegations of violations would be reported and handled by FAA's Flight Services District Office, the FSDO. They would do an investigation, and if any violations were found, the op specs would be potentially impacted, and they would fall under the FAA's enforcement and compliance program. So I think I answered all aspects of the question, Michelle, but thank you. Good question.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks, Eric. Okay. All right, for the next question, we'll have a new face come back on. We'll point this over to Matt with the park. The question is, why was 2,900 AGL altitude for air tours selected versus the existing requested altitude of 2,000 AGL for all other aircraft? And does the 900 feet really make a difference?
Thanks, Michelle. So the 900 feet AGL limit is primarily to protect raptors and migratory birds, and to comply with threatened and endangered species. Primarily the Mexican spotted owl and southwest willow flycatcher and yellow-billed cuckoo. Because raptor nest habitat exists throughout the park, and nests may change over time, the minimum altitude restrictions extends uniformly to all routes over the park. This will also avoid and minimize potential effects on avian species and other wildlife by reducing the noise intensity of the air tours in areas nearest to the routes. Additionally, this will also preserve visitor experience on the ground, including opportunities for solitude and remoteness from sights and sounds in recommended wilderness by reducing the intensity of air tour noise on the ground. The additional separation of commercial air tour operators, depending on the direction of the flight, is a safety measure necessary to de-conflict the airspace over the park within the 1/2 mile buffer, given the 2,900 foot AGL requirement on all air tour routes. I hope that answered your questions. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, the next question will go over to Vicki. They're asking what specific NEPA requirements will it says categorical exceptions, which I think maybe they mean categorical exclusions. What specific NEPA requirements will they exempt this ATMP from? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll try. Well, a categorical exclusion doesn't mean it's exempt from NEPA. It's actually a NEPA pathway that the NPS and the FAA both use for proposed actions. So it just requires a different level of environmental analysis, which we have conducted. And based on that analysis and the proposed action, we're considering using an NPS categorical exclusion, which is 3.3A1 from the NPS National Environmental Policy Act handbook. And that allows changes or amendments to an approved action when such changes would cause no or only minimal environmental impact. So we are completing analysis of effects, which is consistent with NEPA. The type of documentation that is most appropriate to the analysis will be informed by the feedback we received during this public review on the draft air tour management plan to determine if any additional effects not yet identified and analyzed exist, and whether or not there is the potential for adverse impacts that would make a different NEPA pathway more appropriate, such as an environmental assessment instead of a documented categorical exclusion. The agencies will consider the public comments on the air tour management plan, information obtained during consultations, and will fully assess the environmental impacts before making a final determination on what NEPA pathway is appropriate. And I think what the question was, it's not exempt. Categorical exclusion doesn't mean that it's exempt from NEPA. It just means that it's excluded from preparing an environmental impact statement. I hope that answered the question. Thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Vicki. The next question will go back to Eric. They're asking what it would take to have a no-fly ATMP.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the question. So this is a draft air tour management plan, and part of the process is this meeting this evening. And so we encourage anyone who wants to see changes made to the draft ATMP to submit their comments in the Pepsi site. We do want to note that, again, under current interim operating authority, there could be up to 665 commercial air tours over the park. And, we feel that this plan is pretty good. It reduces the number of air tours annually. It has additional conditions requiring flying specified routes at specified altitudes, limits on the aircraft type, the day and time has day and time restrictions for particular events. So obviously you can take a look at the draft plan. And again, we would just encourage you to submit that comment into the Pepsi site. Thank you for the comment. Great.
Okay, and for this next question, we'll bring on a new face again. We'll call on Amy from the park. The question is the ATMP initiative being led by complaints of aircraft noise? And if so, how many documented complaints has the park received, and how are those complaints recorded?
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for the question. No, the ATMP is being prepared because of the requirements of NEPATMA, as was mentioned during that presentation. And the park does not track complaints, but we have received anecdotal reports in the past. But it's important to note again, the air tour management plan is being developed to protect park resources, is not a planning process that has been driven specifically by noise complaints from overflights. So hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question here for Eric this time. The question is, how do you confirm the reported overflights numbers?
How did we confirm the reported numbers? So under NEPATMA, the operators are required to submit to the FAA and PS on a semi-annual basis reports regarding the number of commercial air tours that they have conducted. The air tour management plan now with the flight recording requirements, the flight monitoring data under section 5.1, this information will be more readily available to the agencies. And these reports are due to both agencies no later than 30 days after the close of each reporting period. And those reporting periods are January 1 through June 30th and July 1 through December 31st. So they're semi-annual. And the operators have to adhere to the requirements of the reporting template provided by the agencies. Thank you for the question.
All right. it seems like slowing down a little bit. There's a bit of a lag time between when we see the questions and when they're typed in. So it looks like we may have one or two that are still coming in. So we're going to give you guys a couple of minutes here to continue to type in the questions. And in the meantime, as we wait for them to pop up, we will go off camera and off mic, but the meeting will still be live. And once we've had a chance to have folks get those questions submitted, we'll come back on and get some answers. So we'll be right back. Okay, thank you all for your patience as these questions keep coming in. We're planning to be here until 6 p.m. So please continue to submit them as we continue the Q&A session. So we'll take this next question and pass it over to Vicki. They are asking why the air tours are allowed to fly for free.
Yeah, thanks for that question. The National Park Service was authorized to collect air tour fees through the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993. And that was for aircraft conducting air tours in airspace over certain parks. So currently, NPS collects fees for air tours over Grand Canyon National Park, Haleakala National Park, and Hawaii Volcanoes. Fees are not currently conducted for flights over Canyonlands National Park or any other park other than the 3 that I mentioned. Hope that answers the question, and thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Vicki. Now back over to Eric. They're asking to expand upon the reasons for setting actual minimum flight altitudes of 10,500 and 11,500 feet MSL, which is mean sea level. These are much higher than the 2,900 foot minimum flight altitude AGL of ground level that you talked about.
All right, so thank you for that question. So the 2,900 foot AGL above ground level is a requirement. That's the minimum altitude that operator needed to be, that they need to be at on every portion of the tour route. With 6 operators and 13 routes, we had, obviously, as we did with all the air tour management plans, we had our flight safety people look at the routes and the altitudes, and they were comfortable. We're comfortable from a safety objective, but they also felt the need to express the altitudes in MSL as well, because a lot of pilots, operators use equipment that expresses things in terms of MSL. So there really isn't a difference between the 2 altitudes. It's just how they're expressed, whether 2,900 foot above ground level or 10,500 feet MSL, mean sea level. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, now we have a question we'll pass over to Amy. The question is, shouldn't the rights of visitors who have paid park entrance fees to enjoy the wilderness override the rights of noisy, intrusive aircraft owners who aren't contributing to the park?
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks for the question. As was noted previously, the Air Tour Management Plan is developed to protect park resources, including human impacts from air tours, and the proposed annual flight limits, route restrictions, and minimum altitudes in this ATMP are intended to protect wilderness values and visitor experiences by limiting the number of potential disturbances caused by commercial air tours, providing opportunities for solitude and remoteness from sights and sounds in designated or recommended wilderness areas, and by reducing the intensity of air tour noise at ground level. These hours of operation would provide quiet periods of the day during which visitors can enjoy natural sounds, and they also preserve opportunities for solitude for visitors. So hopefully that answers that question. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Amy. So looks like we might still have a couple more questions coming in. As we noted earlier, we'll give folks time to get your questions typed in, get them over on our end. And so we'll give everybody a few more minutes to get it typed in. Thank you for your patience, and we'll be back on in just a moment. Okay, we have had another question come in. I think we'll go ahead and pass this one over to Vicki. The question is asking what the NPS is doing to preserve the public's right to see national parks from the air and to also have a meaningful overflight experience.
Okay, thanks for the question. As directed by NEPATMA, the agencies are required to develop an air tour management plan to protect resources. We believe that the proposed draft air tour management plan for Canyonlands National Park accomplishes that. And we encourage you to submit your comments to Pepsi if you'd like to see changes made to this draft. This draft does maintain the current level of commercial air tours that are happening that have been flown from, an average over the 2017 to 2019. So, but again, if you have comments on changes to the draft ATMP, please submit those in Pepsi. Hopefully that answered it. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks. All right, so not seeing anything yet on our end, but as stated before, we'll give folks out there a couple more minutes to see if there are any lingering questions that come trickling in. Gauge the meeting to see what kind of traffic we get. So please submit your questions. We'll go off camera and off mic again here, but we'll be in the background waiting to see if anything else comes in. So thank you. So looks like we actually are getting quite a few duplicate questions, so we probably won't be providing like duplicate answers. We did earlier in the presentation, there's a question about why are there 13 different tour routes needed, and there's another question about why you provided ATMP tours to providers that may fly as little as one tour, and we did answer those questions earlier in the presentation. It looks like we may have one or two more questions coming in, so we'll give it another minute or two for the new questions, and we'll be back here in just a moment. Another question here now for Vicki. We've received a question that suggests that air tours are contributing pollution, and because of that they should not be allowed to continue. Can you address that, please?
Yeah, hi, Michelle. Yeah, I'll do my best to address that question. Under this environmental impact process, we're looking at impacts to a variety of resources, including air quality, noise, wildlife, and visitor experience, cultural resources, or a variety of resource topics. So we haven't made a final determination on what the level of impact is for any of those. Like I said, we're looking at those. If you have comments about what resources we should consider in our process, please submit those in Pepsi. And like I said, we look at what the NPS responsibilities under, the NPS Organic Act mandates and also the Clean Air Act. And I won't go into all the details on that tonight because there's a lot of rules and regulations associated with that, but we are considering the impacts to air quality during this process. Thanks. I hope that answers the question.
All right, and it looks like we have time here for one last question, and we'll send this over to Eric. Eric, they're asking if for some reason the ATMP is found to be inadequate, what is the process for amending it?
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for the question. Good question. The ATMP, any interested party basically may initiate the amendment process for whatever reasons. However, the request must be made in writing and submitted to both FAA and NPS. Now, it can't be just for any reason, if you will. The request must include the justification of how the requested amendment is consistent with the objectives of the ATMP with respect to protecting the park resources, tribal lands, visitor use and enjoyment, and why it would not adversely affect aviation safety or the national aviation system. The agencies will publish additional information for interested parties about the form and the manner for submitting a request for an amendment. And any notice, any amendments will be published in the Federal Register, and it would go through a public comment process. And so hopefully that answers the question. There is a process, and we will provide more information in the near future in regards to exactly what that looks like. But thank you for the question. Good.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And thanks to everybody else on the line for being available to answer the questions. And thanks to those of you online also for being there to ask the questions. We're actually now at the end of the meeting. I mentioned earlier I would share contact information for if there's any questions that we didn't get to that you can contact for follow-up. So grab your pin, keep that handy. If anybody joined us late, I just want to make sure that you know there is a FAQ document that's posted with the draft ATMP on the park's public comment site. And you'll see that here on the slide. And now for the phone number, if you had a question that was not answered, you can call Caitlin Thomas. She's a public affairs specialist, and her phone number is 435-719-2107. Again, that's 435-719-2107. And if FAA can also drop that into the chat if you haven't already, it'd be appreciated. Just one more formal reminder that the way to submit official comments on the plan is either through the Pepsi site or sent via mail to the mailing address on the slide. And comments need to be received on or before October 3rd. On behalf of both the FAA and the National Park Service, we do look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for your participation. Have a good rest of your evening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.